Evening to everyone in India, and for everyone joining us from other parts of the world, good afternoon and welcome to episode 21 of Listen In with Sunaparanta. Today's session is titled The Provocative and Fascinating World of Francis Newton Souza and the School of London. It is special for us as we focus on F.N. Souza, whose roots lie in Goa, one of the key figures of Indian art, who forever challenged and provoked us with his graphic and unrestrained imagery. In today's edition, we'll look at Souza's years in London, beginning with an insight into the impact of Picasso on his work, and followed by his relationship with the School of London alongside European contemporaries like Francis Bacon and Lucian Freud. To speak on this, and I'm very happy to welcome Elena Crippa, a curator of modern and contemporary British art at the Tate, and Conor Macklin, director of the Grosvenor Gallery in London. Thank you both for making the time to be with us today. And I'm very looking forward to your presentations very much and to learn from you on this very interesting period of Souza's life. I'm going to briefly introduce you and then hand it over to Leandre to take the conversation forward. Elena Crippa is the curator of modern and contemporary British art, where she works on the research and acquisitions and display of artworks from the 20th and 21st centuries with a focus on the period between 1940 and 1980. She has organized numerous temporary exhibitions. These include London Calling at the J. Paul Getty Museum in Los Angeles, All Too Human, Bacon, Freud, and A Century of Painting Life at the Tate Britain and the National Gallery of Budapest, Objects of Wonder at the Palais Populaire in Berlin in 2019, and Frank Bowling at the Tate Britain also in 2019. Conor Macklin is the director of the Grosvenor Gallery in London and is a specialist on the works of Francis Newton Souza. He's also a great friend of Sunaparanta, and I'm very happy to have him here today. He has organized several exhibitions on the work and life of Souza, including a recent traveling show titled Souza in the 40s that came to Sunaparanta December 2018. He also put together a show on Souza and Picasso in Delhi in 2011. Thank you both for being here, and I'm going to hand it over to Leandre to take this forward.
Thank you, Ishita. I think we will begin with Conor's presentation on the relationship between Souza and Picasso.
So welcome everyone, and I'd like to start this presentation on Souza Picasso, and hopefully I'll be able to explain the impact of Picasso on Souza, but also how Souza differed from Picasso, so the differences between the two. The one clear sort of similarity between the two is that they both tore up the rule book, as one can say. And I think that Picasso did say once that every act of creation is first an act of destruction. So I think that's quite an important point to take on from that. So I'm going to start quickly on Picasso with this first image here. And so Picasso, just to give you a slight, quick little background, you don't need too much because I'm sure you all know this, but he came from an independent region of Spain called Catalonia, and as a young boy was deeply sort of gifted as a child, and so you could say as a child prodigy, especially as drawing and as painting. And before long, he moved to Barcelona, which was then the regional capital, and became sort of the center of the young artists that would hang out in the local bar there called El Quatre Gats, and they would talk and paint, and obviously he quickly established himself as a very successful artist there. But then that was a small town, so he had to go to then the capital of the art world, which was Paris. And in Paris, he immersed himself in a wider group of artists, all bringing different ideas from all different regions of the world. And in 1907, this painting was executed. It's called Le Demoiselle d'Avignon. Now that's in the MoMA collection. He basically interspurred this idea of sort of cubism, which runs parallel to the idea of theory of relativity. So in the picture plane, there's not just one angle, there's lots of different angles. So it means that if you think of like an apple, in the mind, you don't think of the apple just from the one side, which is the traditional point of view. You see it from both sides. So they try to introduce these different angles in here. And obviously Picasso, with this movement, which he went on to establish with Georges Braque and lots of other artists, he became known as one of the fathers of modern art, and fame and notoriety followed him throughout his career. This is not to say that there were not other artists who were part of this movement. There were several, but Picasso, he's stolen their light. So he is the superstar, you can say. And obviously, I just want to show you, well, obviously, how this painting is based, and it comes, and so if you, for this image here, La Demoiselle d'Avignon, this image is based upon a classical scene. So in the top right-hand corner here, if you can see, this is Cézanne's Bathers of 1880, which is basically the basis of Picasso's painting. So they're the ladies having their day out. In Cézanne's painting, it's a nod to antiquity, but Picasso's is more relevant. These are ladies from a brothel in Paris, and so he has modernized the Cézanne composition and made it relevant and contemporary. And also he's introduced elements which are exciting for the time. So he's looked at African masks, especially the fang masks. So you see here these distortions. This is what they were trying to do. So he's taking different ideas from different traditions and making them relevant and making them new. So along comes Souza. And Souza, again, he was came from a very small independent region of India called Goa, which was, Catholic and was Portuguese at the time. So he was raised a Catholic, and actually, in fact, was raised by the same Jesuits as Picasso was, and also was again a bit of a child prodigy. So when he started off, he was, again, greatly talented as a draftsman, and he later wrote that he started drawing in the womb of his mother. And like Picasso, he moved quickly to the biggest city, which was Bombay at the time, and again formed a quick sort of a circle of met a young circle of artists and poets and writers, and they would meet at the Chaitana restaurant and talk and think about their ideas and their sort of rebellion, and then they would go home and paint. And these values were later expounded and came out, and they set up the progressive art movement, which is the first modern movement of India. And in those days, it was rebellious, so they were fighting against the sort of the confines of traditional academic and colonial sort of type painting, but also the Indian revivalist school, which of the Bengal school, and they tried to make a modernist vision. Again, it was like Picasso, Souza was a member of the Communist Party, so there was a left leaning to all these paintings. If you remember the painting on the front, the first slide of mine is now called The Family, but that when it was painted in 1946, he called it "The Proletariat Have No Food to Put on Their Plate." But then, of course, he changed it to make it more amenable as he gave up the communism because he felt it was too confining. So what I like about this particular work, this is from 1949. And so this is when Souza has left India. And this begins his journey as a sort of a modern artist in Britain. And also all these myths as well that surround the artist start. So, as he says in his biography, I arrived in London with only sort of £20, but he had more than £20, because I know in his letters, in his diaries, and in his letters to his friends, he did have another £20, which his mother had given to him. And with that £20, he enrolled on a print course. And also when he came to London, and for the first time, he had a chance to see these paintings by contemporary living artists in the flesh, which he didn't have the opportunity to in Mumbai. He was only going by books. And in one letter he wrote back to his colleagues in the Progressive Art Group, he says, the one man who has upset my ambition of being famous is Picasso. We had seen nothing of Picasso in Bombay. The quantity of his work he has done is in capitals amazing. The quality is astonishing. There is no style that he has not done. He has imitated you, me, Hussein, Ara, Gade, and in his sculpture, Bakre, without we knowing it, or he knowing us. I envy him, I love him, I admire him, I am jealous of him. which his sincere painter wouldn't be proud as well as envious of him. So here he's clearly sort of talking about his admiration for the artist, and this obviously comes out here very strongly in this particularly lovely etching here from 1949. But again, I'd like to show you that we'd like to sort of examine this painting, and in the next slide we'll do so. So here we go. So in the bottom right is Picasso's Demoiselle d'Avignon, and obviously in the top right here you can see is Souza's Demoiselle d'Avignon. You could say it was untitled, but they're the ladies, and like Picasso's ones, it's a nod to Cézanne. So it's a group of nudes, and they're relaxing, having their day out, and they've all got this little basket of fruit. So there's Cézanne's basket of fruit, and down here is Picasso's basket of fruit. And obviously here you see this is a lovely little sketch done by Souza, probably of a painting in London in the gallery. And again, so he's studying Picasso. He's looking at how he does the forms and the shading and the simple sort of abstraction. But yet, what he realizes is that there was great history and culture in India, and he wanted to incorporate that. And so these ladies here, these are not Western ladies. These are like here. These are yakshis or gopinis, and you can see these are Jain sculptures down here from the 2nd or 3rd century. And these are sculptures which he saw in the great exhibition at the Royal Academy that started in India as well of Indian art. And these works are very, very inspirational on Souza. And this starts this whole beginning about where he felt that he was as a modern artist in relation to Picasso, but also to other artists. So this is here again. Souza's taken on the same Demoiselle d'Avignon, but this is in 1962, so 10 years later, and you'll see the freedom of expression and the freedom of movement of then a much more established artist. From 49, he was young and just come to Britain, and here he's called the Young Ladies of from Belsize Park in 1962. So there's no denying that the influence of Picasso on Souza, and also on the whole generation of artists. Many artists have spoken about the impression of Picasso and the school that he created. Achille Gorky, for example, he said that when in 1934, when he was told that Picasso had recently started making messier paintings, the very tidy Gorky replied, "If Picasso drips, I drip." But Picasso, he also said that bad artists copy and good artists steal. And I think that certainly this is what Souza took on from Picasso. It wasn't just the idea of like just doing a Picasso or doing a version of Picasso, but the idea of taking from him as confidently as Picasso took from other artists. There you go. This is a similar painting from 1962, untitled, but again, Weeping Woman. So again, so Souza sort of transposed this again. She's coming from sort of a red sandstone sort of figure. So he's taking on what Picasso has started, but adapting it for the 60s. But it wasn't just Picasso who Souza was interested in. You see, so he went to Paris, and wanted to see the romance and see the excitement of which he had seen in the books of Picasso, of Modigliani, of Soutine, and he incorporated all these elements into his own pictures. So in this painting, this is a painting by Amedeo Modigliani from 1917. This painting, interesting enough, was also taken down by the police for its obscenity, because in Paris in 1917, you were allowed to paint nudes, but you weren't allowed to paint the pubic hair. So Souza's paintings, they were taken down by the police early on in India for their obscenity, as was Modigliani's. And here is a beautiful painting by Souza called Reclining Nude. And again, so obviously the format is very Modigliani-esque. Souza wrote to many of his artists saying that I've seen how Modigliani paints and how he treats his canvas, and but yet, the figure he's put in his painting is this really beautiful sort of black nude, with all her bangles and her head and her hair. So she's a sort of an Indian sort of Venus. I'll get the next image. So what Picasso taught Souza was to take from these other artists and expand them and expand his ideas. So it wasn't just obviously Picasso. There were lots of other artists he wanted to take ideas from, but really what he wanted to do, what he decided to do, was to place himself in a tradition, and this tradition was Western painting, and particularly the Western painting of the human body. And one of the great humanists of all time was Titian, who obviously Picasso was also very sort of influenced by, but so was Souza. And he had to sort of not just copy Titian, but to make Titian's work fit to the 60s and make Titian's works fit to what Souza wanted to achieve. And so in this painting here of Nude Holding Breath from 1960, what you'll see is that Souza has, again, this is an Indian figure, nude, with the bangles and the long hair. Her face is quite sort of Picasso-esque, quite classical, but obviously the pose is from the Renaissance, and it's from these famous series with Mary Magdalene by Titian. So on the left-hand side is the one from Palazzo Pitti, and the right-hand side is the one from the Hermitage. And again, just to show you another example of sort of Souza, taking on Titian. This is obviously on the top left-hand corner is Titian's Venus of Urbino, and on the bottom right-hand side is Souza's version. So, so the clear difference is obviously is quite funny. One is obviously in the background here, obviously these two ladies in waiting, and in Souza's one, it's the reversal. These are two sort of Indian ladies in waiting, one of her sari. But obviously Souza wasn't just a he also wanted to capture the intensity of being a contemporary artist and bringing in new ideas of medium and new visions, because he was a man of his time, and he wanted to challenge certain things. And one aspect which he rebelled against as a young man was that he quoted it. He goes, "I was brought up to believe that Hindu sculpture and Mughal paintings were graven images of the heathen." So he was told that by his colonial sort of teachers that they should look towards the West and whatnot. So Souza was trying to grapple between these two conflicting forces, the West and the East. So in these series of works from 1965. These are called the Kalam works. I mean, these are not much is known about these works, but in these works, he actually he employed a miniaturist to do the paintings for him. So on the left-hand side, you see the instructions, which he was sent to Jaipur to this guy he met from JJ School, and on there are the dots. You see, this is do the colors. This is blue, and this is on the right-hand side is the finished painting, obviously signed by Souza. And so you see the blue's there, and the blue dot, and then he says, these are lines. So these are kind of sort of conceptual works, but again, embracing the Indian tradition of miniature painting, but yet with the outcome of a very contemporary and modern 1960s sort of distorted head. A la Picasso, you could say, it was a cubist sort of work, but totally original and totally modern and never seen before. Of course, it's done in a miniature style. Again, in '65, he was exploring with new ideas of paint and new ideas of material, and he did this series called Black on Black, which is a very, very important show. And this again is a wonderful image of a landscape, just entirely painted in black. It's a radical show for the artist to do at the time. And he was challenging all various sort of notions and identity and race, etc., with these works. So this is another black on black from the Tate. Anyway, this is the one. So I'd just like to round up quickly. Is that so? So when Souza came to London in 1949, he was, young and excited, and had lots of wonderful visions of ideas of how he could take on the world. But his vision then, and his paintings then of the progressive works, which were in large visions of Indian sort of goddesses and in a modern context, didn't really sort of have much resonance in Britain. So he needed to reinvent himself, and he spent 10, 15 years living in Paris and London, not having any success at all, but really sort of focusing on his work. And the one thing which Picasso was very influential on him was that Picasso was an inspiration to show you how to lead, to give up everything, to devote yourselves entirely to your art. And this is a sort of the anxiety and the sort of this a series of expressive paintings which Souza did, which are almost they're critical of himself, but also critical of society, and they're critical of all the institutions that were around at the time. And these the paintings in 1955, which gave him his breakthrough show. They were all done at that time, the breakthrough show and the publications of Words and Lines. And let me just see. So this is, for example, these are, for example, businessmen. There's another one. But these all stem from the same thing I was trying to explain before about the artist putting himself on the line and devoting himself to art and also to the practice. And they are sort of the process of existentialism as such. They're almost looking deep into their own self, and the contradictions that everyone has, they come out in the paintings. And so in Souza's, they wrote a wonderful poem about this called Self-Portrait. And these describe these works and also the works that he went on to do. Eyes in the brow, the better to see with the brain. Stars in the face are the scars of smallpox. Arrows in the neck, like flies, mean affliction. The grinding of teeth is not in the day of resurrection, but today. The jacket, tie, and stiff collar are signs of respectability. And obviously, so with these works, and in the 1950s, Souza challenged everything and challenged himself, and laid clear for everyone to see his confidence, but also his worries and what was perturbing him at the time on the personal level, but also as on a professional level in the painting world. And so his landscapes are scary. His figures are full of charge of expression. And here he is in one of his masterpieces at the Tate, called Crucifixion, with this strikingly black Christ who is deformed, and these wonderful figures either side who again are not celebrating the church. They're not celebrating this institution, but in fact they're challenging it. And this is the anxiety which defined this period so much. And obviously Souza is always going to be held up and against the great expressionist artists of the time, the Sutherlands and the Bacons. But obviously people haven't quite grappled or seen the extent of what Souza was doing. But this is a wonderful example of a work from that period. And I would just like to say that I'll finish up quickly by saying that I'd like to say just quickly, there's a nice little quote that Rashid Areen wrote about Souza from this period. He goes, "For me, it is not important whether he is a genius or not, but he is one of the most important artists of the post-war period, for whom the anxiety of the time was part of a personal anguish, and he articulated this forcefully and expressed it through a highly personal style."
Thank you, Conor, for that. We'll for this extremely elaborate insight into the references, Souza's early references, and taking us through that journey before he enters this post-war London. Should we begin with Elena's presentation?
Thank you so much, Conor. This was really incredibly exciting introduction. I think very much shows the huge importance of Souza as a painter in his own merit, but also in relation to the context in which he developed his work. and in relation to 20th century painting. And in a way, this is very much where I'm picking up. And I will do a slightly different type of presentation because I'm situating Souza in relation to a specific project that I worked with in the past. When I organized an exhibition at Tate Britain, opening in early 2018, dedicated to effectively the School of London. But I wanted to give a slightly longer introduction and explanation of what that exhibition was and why Souza was so important to that exhibition, just to explain in a way how, for me, grappling with Souza in a way also meant grappling with the canon of British art as well as international art, of course. And I hope it takes a little bit on a detour compared to Conor, but I hope it will allow us to come back looking at Souza from a different perspective in the context of the London artist. He was very much shining alongside, but also sort of struggling alongside. So I will begin telling you a little bit about the history of this exhibition I curated. And effectively, it started in 2015 when Tim Potts, the director of the Paul Getty in Los Angeles, asked to basically organize an exhibition together, taking to Los Angeles, to the Getty, the London School of Painters. This effectively made perfect sense for its context because it was the very first exhibition that Getty ever did of painters before sort of after, the 19th century. It was the first 20th century exhibition. And starting with the School of London made perfect sense because all of those artists, Francis Bacon, Lucian Freud, Leon Kossoff, Michael Andrews, Auerbach and Tate, had very much engaged with the history of painting, the long term, reinventing the tradition and pushing into new directions. So showing this small group of artists, many of whom were relatively little known, felt it made sort of perfect sense. And yet the School of London has a complicated history. What was such a thing as the School of London? Effectively began in 1976 when Tate organized an exhibition for the Arts Council titled The Human Clay, in which he invited or collected, bringing together the work of around 35 artists, and very much wanting to show how London was an incredibly important place for the re-engagement of painters within the figurative tradition, but also bridging figuration and abstraction. This exhibition sort of became associated with the School of London because Tate himself wrote an essay for this text explaining the importance of the School of London. But what happened after 76 is that a number of institutions sort of looked at this large group of artists and increasingly, in a way, shrunk it to a smaller and smaller grouping of artists who happened to be associated by friendship. So that sort of led to exhibitions such as a School of London, 6 figurative painters organized by the British Council and Touring International, which again included 6 painters we showed in Los Angeles as part of London Calling, and also led to a final big showing at the Tate Gallery at the time in 91, the Transformation of Appearance, which included 5 of the 6 artists. It did not include Tate. And I'm quoting here from a review by James Hyman, very important art historian who has engaged with the tradition of realism in Britain in the 20th century. And writing a review in Art Monthly following the opening of the Transformation of Appearance, he stated, as a banner headline, the School of London may indeed bring increased public awareness, but at what price? As the dominant and increasingly unacknowledged framework for discussion, the school is deeply flawed. Closures stultify rather than stimulate. To dress up is one thing, to straitjacket quite another. And I think this criticism is hugely important because in a way it's very much addressing the issue of the formation of canon, how the canon can become stultifying, and is an exercise of exclusion at least as much as the formation of a tradition. So when I did my exhibition at Tate, what happened is that my director at the time felt it would have been very interesting to bring back the School of London exhibition to London and see how it would have basically been able to form a loan-based exhibition within our institution. And at that point, we have many discussions, and it was very clear to me that while it could have been interesting and productive to show these 6 artists in a prominent way abroad, where many of them were little known, where if we wanted to address a School of London in London, our duty was very much to, in a way, ask very important questions about this canon and break up the canon, and in a way reopen it up to new possibilities. This became All Too Human, which included 22 artists. And by doing so, it tried very much to push this canon and ask questions about this formation of the tradition of the School of London in many different directions. I will take you through very briefly some of the strategies that I adopt in this exhibition, and then we will refocus on Souza. So what I did with that exhibition, first of all, I started with 4 sort of earlier examples from the first half of the 20th century, Sickert, Bomberg, Spencer, and Soutine. I wanted to sort of hint, this is a much longer history, and one which is really international as much as British. I also, of course, started a sort of series of major figures of the post-war with Francis Bacon, but I also want to show Francis Bacon in relation to other national and international artists, particularly Giacometti, and that sort of moment of critical formations of the notion of existentialism within the fine art tradition, and also with John Deacon, and really much show that photography and painting were in this really important dialogue, and in a way equally important. Deacon was not just a source of inspiration, was a friend and a colleague, worked very closely and developed his work in a close way with Bacon. I also want to show schools and the way art schools were very important in different ways of establishing figuration, particularly the relationship between the eye and the hand in the teaching at the Slade and the Coldstream, where Freud and Huglo were important teachers, and the very different approach of Bomber, which was much more based on a sort of haptic attempt to capture also the tactile quality of reality. In Kossov, Auerbach, Cranfield, and Mead were some of the students. And finally, we come to Souza. Souza, for me, was hugely important and was one of the 2 artists who did not belong to the traditional School of London, who had a monographic room within my exhibition. This was very important exactly because both of them, Souza and Polarigo was the other artist, in different way, fully belong into this narrative and demanded a large space in its presentation, because I really felt in order to fully establish their position within this canon, we had to give them even in a way a special prominence. And in what way did Souza belong to the School of London? Certainly in many ways, but I think foremost, all of those artists, as Conor very much explained in detail in the case of Souza, are artists who very much believe in painting as an activities which is transhistorical and international. It is about an engagement with previous examples. It is about stealing from previous painters, the great painters of the past, but also using that to push that activity into new and different directions. I will just finish briefly telling you about the exhibition, and we will go back to Souza. It's just Rigo was the other artist who had a monographic room. I will not go into detail. And if finished with a group of younger artists who happen to be female. But going back again to Souza, I just want to speak a little bit more particularly about how he was positioned within the exhibition. I already said that in a way, it was important to have Souza because he has this incredible position of learning and pushing the historical transition, because like Picasso did indeed, or Bacon, it was about completely engaging fully with the activity of painting, giving up pretty much everything, as Conor said, but also it was about the importance of addressing existential, socio-political, as well as personal issue in the war moment in Britain. And this is why Bacon came exactly after, Souza came just after Bacon in the presentation. And I will take you through a few slides of these rooms to give you a little further insight. So the rooms dedicated to Bacon starts with the picture you see in the left of the slide, this one, titled Figure in a Landscape. And this picture is very important, it's certainly very important in the exhibition because it was shown in London for the first time in 1945 in the spring as images of the concentration camp were becoming public. The footage was being shown on screens. And in a way, Bacon very much encapsulates the anxiety and sort of existential dimension of his own individuality, resonated fully with the struggle of the post-war, of sort of trying to redefine humanity after the atrocities of the war. It was, of course, also very much a personal anxiety, and some of the pictures in the room include the one of his first lover, Peter Lacy, his sort of incredible portrait with his dark background. And Bacon's homosexuality, of course, was also a very important dimension. He was painting these pictures and was painting many pictures also of couples of men engaging in sexual activity at the time when homosexuality was still illegal. And more broadly, I think in this display, joining Bacon and Giacometti was also about showing very much this moment of great anxiety, this moment of figures standing on their own and contrasting with this background and redefinition of also a way of engaging both with sculpture and painting, and particularly the relation with Giacometti for Bacon is very important in the materic way in which the pigment is applied on the figures in the foreground. And we follow with Souza. For me, this sort of juncture was particularly important because I very much, since the beginning when I started doing the exhibition, felt that in a way they were a perfect coupling. We have Bacon, whose first show is exhibited in London. Well, of course, he started doing work earlier in the 30s, but it abandons art for a period in favor of interior design and more decorative work, and returns fully to painting in 44. Souza starts exhibiting in group exhibition, different presentation is associated with the ICA earlier on, but very much his moment of greater prominence in London begins in 55, which is the dating of the first picture you see on the left of Jesus and Pilatus from 55-56, when he exhibits in Gallery 1. That exhibition is a sold out, and this moment finally for him in London of this recognition and his pictures being acquired into good collection is also yet a moment of great personal struggle, as again Conor explained. And for me it was very important to include the picture that stands on the second to the left, which is titled Negro in Mourning and was painted in 1957. And this is an extraordinary work because, of course, reflects episodes of violent racism in London at the time. It was a decade after an increased number of individuals started migrating in London from the Caribbean, from South Asia and beyond, but also a time of awful increase in racism and in the level of prejudice. And when Souza gifted this picture this picture entered the collection of Sheffield in the 90s, he wrote an extraordinary piece of text in which he said the Negro in Mourning, in a way, he considered it one of his most important paintings because it's close to the bone of man. Because indeed it is about the color of skin. It is the sort of most direct connection with him and of course with his own predicament as an Indian artist who moved in London. I will just take you to the next slide when we see a few more pictures, which include some of those that Conor showed. What also I very much wanted to show through this selection was, in a way, some of his major key works. And the other important link for me with Bacon was this major theme, which Souza himself defined as his more important subjects: religion and sexuality. And of course, the crucifixion and the Black Nude are really incredibly important works in British collection relating to these two subjects. And I think these, again, these two works bring us back to the tradition of painting, to Picasso, Bacon, and I think very much to artists, the three of them, Picasso, Bacon, and Souza, consistently engage with the subject that was the most important to them in life, and particularly relating on one way to a tradition, a very complex, in the case of the three artists, relationship with religion, one that in a way was linked to religions very closely because of an upbringing and because of sharing certain values, certainly in the case of Bacon and Picasso also relating to communism and to this belief in this space of support and conviviality, but also the sort of great dislike for the institution. And the crucifixion is both, I believe, an incredibly complex reference to this conflicted relationship with religion, as well as this sort of figure of the Black Christ, which is, you know, not just crucified, but tortured and torn apart. His body is completely, torn apart. And on the other side, the Black Nude, which brings together these very different traditions of course, Shiva and all these sort of different Indian references that Conor has already mentioned, with most modern examples of nudes, female nudes standing or reclining. And also it was important for me to bring in the landscapes, because I think these landscapes are quite wonderful, again, in the way in which very much make a statement about Souza as a truly cosmopolitan artist. We know he created these pictures of cityscapes combining images from different cities, which he collected, and then he sort of joined together. And to me, they're wonderful images of an artist who was also an immigrant, as many of us are, and have this very personal understanding of how our existence is about the connecting tissues of many different places, and the images and memories of many different places which are brought together in a sort of ideal space. And finally, the presentation ended with the black painting that you see on the left. In this case, it was two saints. It was painted in 1965. Just checking the dates. And it was included in the 66 exhibition, which Conor also mentioned, which was of black on black, black art and other paintings at Grosvenor in 1966. And for me, it was also very important, as we started with one of the pictures that connected back to his moment of glory, 55, 56, his first exhibitions, which were very successful at Gallery 1. It was very important to end with a painting from this moment. I think they're extraordinary things. I wish so much, it could have been there at that moment in 66. It must have been quite extraordinary to enter in this room and be surrounded by these incredible pictures which are blacked, but because of the different application of paint, reflect light in different orientations. And so they create this, they have this gem quality, and they, of course, they very much vary depending on your positioning in relation to the picture. They're also very important to me because for me here, Souza is measuring himself on one side with the long painting tradition again. You cannot think of Malevich when you see a black, nearly square picture. But of course, it's also about blackness. It's about its constant return to the experience, notions, and issues of blackness. And I think, identity, the sort of issues and questions about identity they experience, but also the experience of prejudice and the one of racism that he experienced directly or indirectly, as recorded in Negro Morning, is something that also inevitably shaped his life in London. And for me, in a way, creating this room within All Too Human at Tate was also a statement about the canon, about its importance within the canon, but also a reminder that we always, as art historians, need to fight not to give prominence once more to an artist and then allow him to sort of fall out of the picture, because we do not actively create narratives in which they are inserted in a more permanent basis. After painting these black pictures, which mostly remained unsold, Souza left for New York, sort of hoping for a new sort of wave of success. And I think that was really a great loss for Britain at that moment. I think there is a moment where I hope an exhibitions like this might be one of the many that create new narratives of British art, in which we can really see how much Souza belonged to Britain, to the British School of London, and to sort of the most extraordinary development in European painting at that time. I think I will leave it to that.
Thank you, Elena, for showing us how integral Souza was to the post-war British art scene. I think we have just a few minutes for a discussion. I just want to begin, and feel free to answer either Conor or Elena, or both actually. It's always been difficult to define Souza. He's not just an Indian artist, even though he was regarded as one of the fathers of modernism and also the catalyst of the progressive artist group. But was he ever considered a British artist?
Well, I think that this has been talked about quite a few times. I think John Berger, who was the eminent critic and writer, he wrote that Souza, let me get it right, he said something like, Souza serves no tradition, or something. I'm going to get it wrong. Souza basically straddles both traditions but serves none. So he was, he was in the Western tradition and the Indian tradition, but didn't serve any. So he was like straddling the two. So that's a very good sort of contemporary sort of analysis of Souza at the time.
No, just to say that, of course, we do consider him a very important British artist, at least by now, I would certainly say. And we have at least, we have been having for a while a very clear understanding of what is British at Tate, as someone who contributed greatly to British art, independently from their place of birth or the fact that they lived all their life in Britain. Whether that truly indented the canon, as I explained, is a bit more complex and requires greater scrutiny.
Yeah.
I think there was a story that when the Tate published their collection of international artists sometime in the late 60s, Souza wasn't included in there. So he was furious, and so he wrote to the then director and said, "Why have I been excluded again?" And then the director very, very happily wrote back and said, "Oh, but Souza, you were included in our previous publication of British artists." So he's just been put in. He felt that he was an international artist, but he's been put into the British box.
All right. Now, in the show All Too Human, this is the first time we're actually seeing Souza alongside European colleagues like Bacon, Freud, Auerbach. I'm curious to know, what was the response to Souza being present in that show? How did curators or art historians or the general public react to that?
I would say quite different in different ways. I would say that there were a couple of instances which ultimately, in hindsight, don't surprise, of the very conservative, fundamentally racist press, which took issues with it. It's like, oh, you know, how does it fit? You know, we know very well that the School of London were, you know, these other artists. It's like, didn't fit. He wasn't friend with them. He didn't belong to the group. Exactly what, in a way, I wanted to challenge with my presentation. But I also had incredible responses. Certainly, you know, taking around so many visitors, curators, the museum director during the time of the exhibition. And this includes the press, of course. And for me personally, what touched me the most was the response by many of the artists, particularly younger artists, who did not know the work of Souza or were not so familiar with it, and very much felt that it was a big, you know, important revelation. And it was really wonderful to see him alongside these other sort of titans of British painting.
I'd like to add that I know that from the Indian side, certainly they were very sort of happy to see Souza put in that context, and I think they learned a lot. You know, the collectors and admirers of Souza, they learned a lot to see him, you know, in the context of these British artists. So yeah, I think it was a very well received show.
Now, both of you showed us the Black Christ figure. Elena, the show was also the work was also part of your show, and Conor, you spoke about that in reference to challenging the institution. I'm wondering, Souza takes inspiration from Picasso, but here he adapts it and he presents Christ as Black. At the time in 1959, was this work even accepted?
No, it's a very good question, actually. I'm not aware of polemics relating to the color. Actually, I think in a way, I don't know, I want to be, it's a very interesting question. My sense that, you know, there was possibly less discussions about the subjects at the time. There was a very clear understanding the painting was abstracting qualities. There was, I don't know, I don't have any recollections of it being discussed in these terms. Do you, Conor?
I think that certainly the issue about Souza and his sort of take on Catholicism and the images of Catholicism are rooted in Goa, and obviously in that very sort of tortured and very sort of graphic sort of displays of persecution, but also self-persecution, and you know, so when you see a Christ in Goa, I mean, you know, who's been you know, after crucifixion or after flagellation, he's bloody. There's blood all over him. You know, Christ in Western art are pristine. They are whiter, and I think Souza was very aware of that notion, and that's what perhaps he's trying to explain. And I think that there are in Goa black Madonnas which are worshipped. So you know, that's probably where it's coming from. That's where it's originating. But I think that the shock value is certainly something which he must have been aware of.
Was there any relationship between his depictions of Christ suffering, which also actually ties into the Negro in Mourning work, and his experience of discrimination in Britain? Are there any connections?
I think that in Souza's personal incidents of racism against him, obviously he felt it, he struggled like everyone else. Perhaps he struggled more because of his color. But you know, obviously, you must remember that he had a great success, and he was a sellout artist. You know, he bought a mansion, you know, in Belsize Park. You know, he was he was part of the scene. He was, you know, representing Britain in shows. You know, he was successful. And of course, he found it difficult, but for him, as I said before, it was his painting that mattered, and that was his drive. And you know, anything that came in his way was second to that. So for him, the painting was more important.
Yeah, and it was nonetheless, I think, occupying a very important conversations. You know, I mean, if you think of Grant Sutherland, you think of the many crucifixions of Bacon, Picasso, of course, engaging with the topic of the crucifixion and doing something which was so incredibly powerful in dialogue with all these different examples and tradition, and yet proposing, you know, this very personal perspective, and as you say, having, you know, a Black Christ. I think was also, you know, in a very aware way, a manner of tackling, hugely important subject in art history and within contemporary practice from a very personal, in a very personal way, which resonated with his experience as well.
Yeah, I think that I'd like to add is, like, if you look at, for example, that painting, Saint Sebastian, which it places very firm in the 50s. It's a brown Saint Sebastian. It's a self-portrait, isn't it? He's putting himself on the line. He's saying, "Here I am the persecuted one.
Yeah.
I am the one who struggled to get there." That is a common thread with a lot of expressionist artists of the period. But again, I'd like to also add that Souza was part of that sort of Soho milieu, which was a progressive young crowd. And in that milieu, he was widely accepted.
I'm curious to know, what was the relationship with Souza and the other contemporary artists from the time, and from the School of London? Was he friends with Bacon? Did they hang out together?
No, there was no connections of friendship. I mean, famously, one of certainly the sort of milieu that I would say Souza was more avant-garde to a point. It was certainly the institutions and people that he sort of was part of from the ICA, particularly initially through his writing and publishing, but also group exhibitions and then Gallery One. It was definitely a much more, I would say, avant-garde stroke bohemian environment than the one of many of these painters. I mean, the School of London, they are the sort of titans now, but truly most of them, apart from Bacon, really, I mean, they were very much worked in isolation. They didn't like this sense of belonging at all. And mostly most of the friendship was between two of them rather than them truly being a group.
I think that I know that when Souza first came to Britain in 49, his friendship was largely Indian and expats, and it took him a while to get out of that sort of group and meet other artists and become accepted. And so but by the 50s, as Elena was saying, he was hanging out at the ICA, hanging out in these bohemian sort of groups, and became very close to several artists who had his works, and but also writers. And Ivan Hitchens, for example, he was the person who bought Souza's. I think one of the work was donated to the V&A from the Ivan Hitchens collection. Martin Bradley was again a very close person of his, and there was this sort of society of artists who Souza was part of as well, and they would share and do exhibitions together. So yes, he was very much a part of the scene by the 50s on, and for the period up to the sort of until he left for New York. He was part of that avant-garde. But obviously, what you got to remember is that post 60s, the mood changed in Britain. So the pop was around, and America was on the rise, and there wasn't a calling or need for these strong expressive artists. Mm-hmm. There's almost their bravado and what they've done was a bit out of fashion.
Conor, you had also talked briefly about Souza's move to London in 1949. How did that new landscape affect did it completely alter his subject matter and canvas?
When he came in 1949, he was excited, he was enthusiastic, and he had a show in 1951, and it was pretty much panned by the critics, because I think that his style just didn't resonate, or his painting, the subject didn't resonate in Britain. And yes, I think that it took him a long time to find his feet and to break through, really. And there's lots of examples of him, knocking on galleries' doors like every other artist, trying to get inroads and whatnot. And I think it was a gallery in Paris that actually finally introduced him to have his first group show, but that wasn't until 3 or 4 years after arriving. So yes, he changed dramatically. He had to evolve. The leopard changed its spots, but that's probably the reason why he's so exciting, because he didn't get stuck. He didn't stay being a progressive artist. He moved on, became an artist of the London scene.
Maybe not directly, but maybe linking back also with your previous questions. I think that the sort of fate and success of many of these artists, as Conor mentioned, was changed over time. And I think I really like that Conor the point Conor made about things changed a lot in the 60s, because I did mention the sort of the fact that none of it, the painting of black on black pictures remain mostly unsold and is moved to the United States, New York. And yet I think it's very good to contextualize that in a broader sort of context. Apart from Bacon, remains this sort of extraordinary bit figure. Artists like Lucian Freud, of Auerbach, of Kossoff have, really 2 decades also of quite great struggles. They have the support of the British Council, they have the support of some, important British institution, which helps greatly, but truly beyond that sort of realm of, major sort of state institutions, there are very little shows, and they are not shown at all internationally, but even nationally. So I think, Souza was not alone in this moment of struggle also of painting as a category, when between the sort of pop art moment and the minimalist conceptual art and the late 80s, really, it's a really period of struggles for painters. And what is extraordinary is that they keep at it, and they keep working within their activity, independently from the level of success themselves.
When we look at representation at the time, how are these artists that are all struggling at the same time, that have all moved now to this London that has been devastated by war, etc. How do they represent these anxieties of this of the city, but also how is their representation of trauma or loss or healing? How is that different from, say, the Romantics before that? Mm. How is that manifested in the School of London?
It's a really big question, but something that which hasn't come up yet when I was talking about School of London, is that on one side, compared to previous generations, something which is really, I think, important to state about this grouping of artists, which is mostly biographical, it is that they were truly international, and that they were bringing in incredibly different personal experiences, as well as in many cases different painterly and direct experience of different work. So when we look just at the School of London, very important painters at the time, you had a 2nd generation Jewish immigrant, Freud and Auerbach were child refugees. You have someone like Souza, who came from India, Rigo, who moved, sort of left the dictatorship in Portugal and came to study in London. So there was something, I think, about a very particular experience of trauma. It was not just the experience of London as, needing to heal because of the bombing, the experience of the war. It was also many artists, painters who came to that context with previous traumas. They were coming from, the experience of the Holocaust. They were coming from the experience of dictatorship. They were coming from the experience of British colonial power. And I think this really creates an incredible mix of personal experiences that bring this very layered dimension, also to the work, and an investment to this very experimental way of working with the medium and engaging with what was really a cutting edge way of pushing the relationship between also figuration and abstraction, I think, which is something very important in all of them. And also the way in which they synthesize forms and the importance of this very graphic quality, I would say, in all of them. There is something so incredibly forceful, the gestuality and this sort of really vital energy that you can describe as guiding, the hand of the artist. So I think all of these biographical and technical aspects are combined with incredibly rich and complex biography with these layered experiences of traumas, if you want.
Most art prior to sort of the Second World War was, representational, and the trouble is that I think for an artist to do representational art, post-war looked a bit stupid, because all the institutions were they hadn't served their purpose. So out of this rose all these artists who were questioning that credibility and representational solidness. And, like Paolozzi, especially, he did the series of damaged and broken figures, some damaged Icarus, damaged warrior, damaged thing. And it was about the hollowness and, the existential sort of hole which was left by the Second World War, which all these artists questioned. So it's in that context which Souza and these other School of London artists are expressing themselves. And so that's why that's why you see the picture plane is all over the place. But there's also this personal mess coming out, from all these people.
And I think, Conor, there is also a lot about that sort of movement between, the Parisian art informel moment and then the American abstract expressionism. And, they were also responding to also all these different forces and negotiating these different, very important painterly approaches.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that, it'd be a very interesting angle, isn't it? The whole sort of abstraction versus figuration, and because all these push and pulls going on around the time.
Mm.
But before I end with the last question, I wanted, so both of you have brought this this relationship to existentialism in the discussion as well, and I feel that this is evoked further in both the works of Souza and also in Bacon from the show as well, especially in terms of how human experience is depicted, how trauma is depicted, anguish, agony, etc. I'm wondering if we could look a little bit at that relationship, because it's really a unique one to see these two artists fitted together.
Yeah, I think there is such a huge amount to talk about in this case, but I really feel that moment where, both artists, in a way, this moment of moving from a very strong Catholic upbringing to a secular understanding of the world, at a moment at the end of the war where there was this complete loss of sort of guiding rules. There were no more, the sort of the church, I felt, the sort of politicians that were meant to guide people into a sort of better experience, and brought countries into this huge massacre. And there was the looming of the atomic bomb in the background. And in a way, it was this desperate need to grapple with this lack of guiding principles, and a need for individuals to find a new rootedness. And I think for artists like Bacon and Souza, ultimately the response is in their personal, embodied, sheer, vital experience. And I think it's no coincidence that Souza more than one describe sexuality and religious and his more important themes that he grapples with, and equally Bacon are, these are the two very subjects he keeps returning to, the haunting figures of the popes, of the crucifixion, of the two figures in bed, and the struggle of that relationship sort of staged on a bed. I think it is an existentialism, but one that ends up being incredibly strongly embodied in their physicality. So it's a very, very particular take, I would say.
Someone said it to me once that Souza is the heterosexual version of Bacon, but I kind of don't really sort of,
It's to the point, for sure. Yeah.
But I'm not sure about that one. But.
Now for Souza, the future, he envisioned the future as being ugly and this sterile dream. How do you think he would have responded to this pandemic that we're all?
Oh, wow.
That has completely altered our lives.
I can just say that I feel there is something extraordinary in Souza, which is not in any of the artists we have discussed, which is representations of couples and groupings. The sort of persistence of the two figures and this, incredibly balanced compositions, but also groupings of individuals like in the Deposition, and going back, I think, to these Catholic tropes, because they, within the iconographic tradition of that representations, they very much embody collectivity. And I do think that Souza's work and his sort of way of thinking of communality, for me, strikes a very particular chord. There is something about that coming together in his pictures throughout different periods, well into the 80s, when he paints these beautiful, again, sort of couples, sort of, you know, quite at times gentle and romantic sexual encounters, but also, you know, the figure of the two saints, these figures of partnerships and being together. And I do think that I don't know what he would have said about the situation, the pandemic, but there is a sort of something really positive about that sense of communality and very specific to his work that you wouldn't find in a Bacon or other artists from his time.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what he would have said, but it does bring to mind a story that when this one guy who befriended Souza, and it was when Souza was down and had no money and was in New York and was struggling, and he said to this guy, okay, so we're meeting for lunch, and the guy goes, yeah, and Souza goes, okay, so where are we going to go? We go to this restaurant, your favorite, okay, fine. So I'm going to have the chicken and chips, whatever, and a can of Coke, and that's going to cost $5. So you just give me the $5 and I'll survive on my vitamins. The guy goes, no, don't worry. I want to take you for lunch. I'll give you the $5 and I'll take you for lunch. And I think they went for lunch. But so I think that there you go. So Souza I think he would have been fine, basically.
All right. Before we end, we have audience question that we just take. Are there more recent contemporary artists who draw inspiration from Souza?
Well, I mean, there's quite a few. There's definitely lots of guys in India who young artists who follow his work very, very closely and do work in the same style. And but I think that a lot of artists, especially Indian artists, regard him as a sort of as he was the guy that broke through, from the progressive story, but also from what he was doing in Britain and seeing these shows in London. So his importance is unmatched and is very, very important. And I think you ask any of the artists, they admire what he did, and they don't necessarily sort of do pastiches of his work, but they admire him for what he managed to achieve.
All right. Thank you so much, Elena and Conor, for your time. It's been absolutely wonderful listening to you, and thank you for sharing your knowledge and also for sharing this unique perspective and light on Souza that many don't even know about his years in England, how tumultuous and complex they were, and also how important and relevant he was to the art scene at that time. And also, Elena, what you said about this sense of coupling and gathering and togetherness, it's something really beautiful to reflect on. And I thank our audience for listening in, and thank you so much and have a good evening.
You too. Thank you.